Why the Buddha allowed women into the Sangha and the consequences. The question of why the Buddha allowed women into the Sangha does not begin with doctrine, rules, or historical debate. It begins with something far quieter and closer to home, the human experience of wanting to belong to a life of meaning, and the pain that arises when that longing meets resistance. Across cultures and centuries, people have always felt the pull toward a deeper freedom, a way of living that is not entirely consumed by survival status or expectation. Yet that pull is never felt in abstraction. It arises in bodies shaped by culture, gender, class, fear, and vulnerability. The early Buddhist community was no exception. It was not an ideal floating above history, but a fragile gathering of human beings trying to live out a radical vision of liberation within the limits of their time. When we speak of the Buddha and the Sangha, it is easy to imagine a perfect moral clarity, decisions made from pure compassion without consequence or cost. But the lived reality of any spiritual community is more complex. Insight does not erase the conditions of the world, it moves within them. The Sangha arose in a society structured by rigid hierarchies, deep assumptions about gender, and real dangers for those who stepped outside the protection of family and caste. Renunciation was not merely a spiritual act, it was a social rupture. To leave home was to step into uncertainty, exposure, and dependence on the goodwill of others. These realities shaped every decision, even those made by someone fully awakened. The presence of women at the edge of this emerging community brought all of these tensions into focus. Their aspiration was unmistakably sincere, yet their inclusion raised questions that went far beyond spiritual capacity. It touched on safety, stability, perception, and the survival of the teaching itself. To understand why the Buddha ultimately allowed women into the Sangha and why that decision carried lasting consequences, we must look not only at ideals of equality or enlightenment, but at the human landscape in which compassion had to operate. This is not a story of progress or failure, but of wisdom engaging with reality and of a path that unfolds not in purity but in complexity. To understand the first hesitation that arises in this story, we must set aside modern assumptions and step carefully into the world in which the early Sangha took shape. Ancient northern India was not merely different from our own time. It was governed by a web of customs that defined safety, honor, and survival in ways that are difficult to translate directly into contemporary terms. Social life was organized around households and lineage, with protection flowing outward from family structures and inward toward those who depended on them. To step outside that framework, especially as a woman, was to lose not only social status but physical security. The life of a wandering renunciant was austere, exposed, and reliant on alms. It was a life already considered precarious even for men, who moved with greater freedom and social legitimacy. The early Sangha itself was a fragile experiment. It depended on public trust, on the generosity of lay supporters, and on the perception that its members lived with restraint, dignity, and discipline. Any threat to that perception could have severe consequences. Rumor, suspicion, or scandal did not remain abstract concerns. They could cut off food, shelter, and protection. The Buddha understood this, not as a theoretical risk, but as a lived reality. The teaching had only just begun to take root. It was not yet insulated by centuries of tradition or institutional support. In such a context, caution was not a sign of narrowness but of responsibility. When women first sought ordination, they did so not as a symbolic gesture, but as a profound renunciation of their assigned roles. To become a nun meant leaving marriage, motherhood, and the domestic sphere that defined female virtue. It meant stepping into public visibility in a way that society did not know how to interpret. This visibility carried danger, not only for the women themselves, but for the community that would shelter them. The Buddha's initial reluctance when seen through this lens, appears less like exclusion and more like an awareness of how easily a noble aspiration could be crushed by social forces beyond anyone's control. There is also a psychological dimension to consider, one that reaches beyond historical circumstance. The Sangha was built on a radical abandonment of self-centered identity, yet it was inhabited by people still in the process of transformation. Desire, attachment, fear, and confusion had not vanished, simply because one shaved one's head and donned robes. The discipline of monastic life was designed precisely because human tendencies persist even under the banner of awakening. Introducing women into this environment meant acknowledging the realities of attraction, projection, and imbalance, not as moral failures, but as conditions that required careful containment. This was not about doubting women's capacity for awakening, but about recognizing the unfinished work within men. At the same time, the Buddha was acutely aware that the Dharma did not belong to any single group. Awakening was not the privilege of gender, caste, or circumstance. This truth was already implicit in his teaching and evident in his encounters with women as lay practitioners, mothers, daughters, and seekers. They listened, understood, practiced, and realized insight in ways that could not be dismissed. The tension then was not between truth and falsehood, but between truth and timing. Wisdom does not only ask what is right, it asks what is sustainable. The early Sangha walked a narrow path between embodying a vision of liberation and remaining intelligible to the society that sustained it. Too radical a departure from social norms could provoke backlash that would harm everyone involved, especially the most vulnerable. This is a recurring pattern in human history. Transformative ideas often emerge gently, constrained by the very conditions they seek to transcend. The Buddha's teaching was revolutionary, but it unfolded step by step, adapting without surrendering its core insight. His caution regarding women's ordination can be seen as part of this gradual unfolding rather than a contradiction of his realization. Yet caution alone cannot account for what followed. The persistence of women seeking ordination reveals something equally important. Their request was not impulsive or rebellious, it was rooted in lived understanding. They had seen the fruits of the path, they had experienced suffering deeply, and recognized the possibility of freedom. Their determination was not an argument, but a presence, a quiet insistence that truth, once seen, cannot be unrecognized. This insistence placed the Buddha before a mirror of his own teaching. If liberation is universal, then any boundary drawn around it must be provisional, not absolute. Part of what makes this moment so human is that it exposes the limits of even the wisest response. No decision could resolve all tensions. Allowing women into the Sangha would introduce challenges that could not be fully anticipated or controlled. Refusing them would contradict the very heart of the path. The Buddha's hesitation, therefore, can be read as the pause of someone who sees the weight of consequence clearly and refuses to treat it lightly. It is the pause before accepting complexity, not the pause of denial. In this light, the early Sangha appears not as a perfected institution, but as a living organism, growing, adapting, and sometimes straining under the demands placed upon it. The inclusion of women would not simply add members, it would alter the shape of the community, its rules, its vulnerabilities, and its future. This alteration was not a flaw but an expression of impermanence at work. Everything that arises must change, even a community founded on awakening. By lingering here, at the threshold of inclusion, we begin to sense the deeper meaning of the Buddha's decision. It was not an abstract endorsement of equality, nor a reluctant concession, but a recognition that the path of liberation cannot be protected by exclusion without losing its integrity. At the same time, it acknowledged that compassion does not eliminate consequence. It bears it. This bearing, this willingness to accept difficulty for the sake of truth, marks a turning point, not only in the history of Buddhism, but in our understanding of how wisdom lives in the world. When the decision was finally made to allow women into the Sangha, it did not arrive as a dramatic declaration or a philosophical triumph. It emerged quietly through persistence, presence, and the undeniable sincerity of those who stood asking to be received. The women who sought ordination did not argue theory. They embodied understanding. They had listened, practiced, reflected, and seen for themselves the truth of impermanence and the possibility of release. Their request was not a challenge to authority, but a confirmation of the teaching's reach. In them, the Dharma was already alive. To deny that reality would have been to deny the evidence of awakening as it appeared in human form. This moment reveals something essential about compassion as lived experience rather than ideal. Compassion is not merely the wish that beings be free from suffering. It is the willingness to respond when suffering stands before us with clarity and resolve. The Buddha's allowance of women into the Sangha can be seen as an act of responsiveness rather than concession. It acknowledged that the path he had articulated had already taken root beyond the boundaries initially imagined. Once that truth was visible, the integrity of the teaching required recognition, even if recognition brought difficulty. Yet this inclusion was not without structure or condition. The additional rules that accompanied women's ordination are often discussed in isolation, abstracted into arguments about fairness or hierarchy. But when viewed through the lens of lived community, they appear as attempts, however imperfect, to protect a fragile ecosystem. These structures reflected concern for safety, stability, and public trust, but they also carried the imprint of cultural assumptions that could not be shed overnight. The result was a community that affirmed spiritual capacity while simultaneously encoding inequality, a tension that would echo long after the Buddha's lifetime. The presence of women within the Sangha changed its internal dynamics in subtle and profound ways. It brought into sharper focus the relational nature of practice. Monastic life is often imagined as solitary, yet it unfolds within networks of interaction, responsibility, and mutual influence. The inclusion of women required new forms of attentiveness, restraint, and humility from everyone involved. It exposed unresolved patterns of desire and control, not as moral failings, but as conditions requiring awareness. In this sense, the Sangha became a more honest mirror of the human mind, reflecting not only its capacity for liberation, but its lingering entanglements. For the women themselves, ordination was not an escape from difficulty, but a transformation of it. They entered a life that demanded renunciation, discipline, and endurance, often under greater scrutiny and with fewer protections than their male counterparts. Their commitment was tested not only by the rigors of practice, but by the weight of expectation and limitation. Yet within these constraints, many realized profound insight. Their awakening did not arise in spite of difficulty, but through it, demonstrating that freedom is not granted by circumstance, but discovered through understanding. The consequences of this inclusion unfolded gradually, shaped by time, place, and human interpretation. As the Sangha spread across regions and generations, the original balance between insight and caution shifted. Rules hardened into hierarchies, and pragmatic measures took on the appearance of eternal law. In some contexts, women's communities flourished. In others, they faded or were absorbed into structures that marginalized their voices. These outcomes were not the result of a single decision, but of countless choices made by people grappling with fear, power, and uncertainty. What is striking is how clearly this mirrors patterns found far beyond religious institutions. Whenever a marginalized group is included within an established system, the system itself is transformed. Inclusion reveals tensions that were previously hidden, challenging assumptions about authority, purity, and control. It forces a reckoning with the difference between principle and practice. The early Sangha was no notion. By allowing women into its midst, It confronted its own incompleteness, its reliance on convention, and its vulnerability to distortion. At the heart of this moment lies a paradox central to Buddhist understanding. The Dharma points toward non-attachment, yet it must be carried by forms that inevitably attract attachment. Institutions arise to preserve insight, yet those institutions are subject to decay and misuse. The inclusion of women illuminated this paradox with particular intensity. It showed that awakening does not abolish the need for structures, but it does reveal their provisional nature. No rule, however well-intentioned, can substitute for wisdom. No boundary can fully contain truth. This realization does not lead to cynicism but to humility. The Buddha's decision did not resolve the tension between equality and protection. It exposed it. It acknowledged that liberation unfolds within imperfect conditions and that compassion sometimes requires accepting unresolved complexity. The women who entered the Sangha did not receive a flawless refuge. They helped create a more honest one. Their presence ensured that the teaching would be tested, not only in solitude but in relationship, not only in ideal form but in lived reality. As we sit with this part of the story, it becomes clear that the consequences of inclusion were not merely institutional but existential. They asked every member of the community to confront the gap between aspiration and embodiment. They revealed that the path is not a withdrawal from human difficulty but an engagement with it grounded in awareness. In allowing women into the Sangha, the Buddha affirmed a truth that remains challenging even now, that awakening is universal, but its expression is always shaped by the conditions we inherit and the courage with which we respond to them. As time moved forward, the decision to include women in the Sangha revealed its deepest consequences, not in any single rule or controversy, but in the slow unfolding of human behavior across generations. Institutions have a way of solidifying what was once responsive and situational. What begins as a careful adjustment to circumstance can, over time, be mistaken for timeless truth. The early accommodations made in a fragile social environment gradually hardened into inherited structures, and the living insight that once animated them became increasingly distant. This was not a unique failure of Buddhism, nor the result of ill intent, but a familiar pattern wherever teachings are preserved through form. The Sangha, like all human communities, was shaped by those who held authority within it. As centuries passed, leadership became more centralized, more invested in continuity than inquiry. In such conditions, difference is often experienced as threat rather than enrichment. Women's presence, once a testament to the universality of awakening, became a site of anxiety about order, discipline, and legitimacy. Protective measures, originally rooted in concern, were reinterpreted as justifications for exclusion. The subtle shift from care to control is rarely noticed as it happens, yet its effects are enduring. This evolution invites a deeper reflection on impermanence, not as an abstract teaching, but as a lived truth within spiritual life itself. The Buddha spoke of all conditioned things as unstable, yet it is often institutions founded on his insight that most resist this understanding. The Sangha's struggle with gender reflects a broader human tendency to grasp at form as a source of security. When liberation is glimpsed, there is a desire to preserve it intact, to shield it from distortion. Ironically, this desire can lead to rigidity, the very opposite of the flexibility that insight requires. For women practitioners across history, the consequences of this rigidity were felt intimately. In some cultures, nunneries became centers of learning and practice, quietly sustaining the teaching through devotion and discipline. In others, the lineage faded, leaving women to practice in marginal or unofficial ways. Yet even where institutional support was lacking, aspiration did not disappear. The longing for freedom does not depend on permission. It arises wherever suffering is clearly seen, and it finds expression even in constrained forms. In this sense, the spirit of the early women who sought ordination never vanished. It adapted, endured, and re-emerged in unexpected places. The persistence of this aspiration reveals something essential about the nature of the path. Awakening is not owned by structures, even those designed to protect it. It moves through individuals, relationships, and moments of clarity that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. The Sangha's history with women illustrates how easily this movement can be obscured, but also how resilient it is. Even when recognition is withheld, understanding continues to unfold where conditions allow. This resilience does not excuse exclusion, but it reminds us that truth is larger than the forms that carry it. At the same time, the long arc of consequence challenges any romantic notion of spiritual progress. Inclusion alone does not guarantee equity, and insight does not automatically dismantle power. The Buddha's decision opened a door, but walking through it required ongoing courage, humility, and vigilance from those who followed. Where these qualities were absent, old patterns reasserted themselves. Where they were present, new possibilities emerged. The difference lay not in doctrine, but in attention, in the willingness to question inherited assumptions and respond freshly to present conditions. This tension between inheritance and inquiry remains deeply relevant. Modern practitioners often look back at early Buddhism seeking clarity or authority, hoping to resolve contemporary questions by appealing to origins. Yet the story of women in the Sangha suggests a different approach. Rather than searching for final answers, it invites us to notice how wisdom responded to complexity without pretending to eliminate it. The Buddha did not offer a blueprint for all time. He offered a way of seeing that could engage changing circumstances with discernment and care. In this light, the consequences of allowing women into the Sangha are not confined to debates about ordination or lineage. They point toward a broader ethical responsibility to recognize when protective measures become barriers and when tradition becomes an excuse for avoidance. They ask us to consider how fear can masquerade as prudence and how compassion can be narrowed by habit. These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they cannot be settled once and for all. They must be lived. The Sangha's history also reveals the cost of unresolved tension. When inclusion is partial or conditional, it creates an undercurrent of strain that affects everyone involved. Those excluded carry the weight of invisibility, while those included inherit an unspoken unease. The community as a whole becomes less transparent, less able to meet itself honestly. This diminishment is subtle but cumulative. It does not destroy the teaching, but it obscures its full expression. And yet, within this imperfect unfolding, there remains a quiet continuity of insight. The Dharma persists not because institutions are flawless, but because human beings continue to turn toward understanding. The women who practiced in constrained circumstances, the men who questioned inherited norms, the teachers who listened more deeply than they defended, all contributed to keeping the path alive. Their efforts remind us that consequence is not destiny. It is an invitation to awareness. As we reflect on this long history, we may notice how easily it mirrors our own lives. We too inherit structures, roles, and expectations that shape our understanding. We too struggle to balance care with openness, protection with trust. The story of women in the Sangha is not only about gender or monasticism. It is about how wisdom lives within limitation. It asks whether we can remain faithful to insight while acknowledging fear, whether we can allow change without losing our center. In this way, the Buddha's decision continues to speak, not as a settled judgment, but as an ongoing question. It invites each generation to examine how liberation is expressed in its own context and whether the forms it relies upon still serve their purpose. The consequences of that ancient moment are still unfolding, not as a burden to be resolved, but as a mirror held up to our capacity for discernment, humility, and care. When we step back from the long sweep of this story, What remains is not a verdict, but a texture of understanding. The Buddha's decision to allow women into the Sangha was neither a simple affirmation nor a reluctant compromise. It was an expression of wisdom meeting the world as it is, not as it ought to be. It acknowledged that liberation cannot be withheld without distortion, and that compassion, once awakened, cannot turn away from sincerity simply because it brings difficulty. At the same time, it revealed how deeply conditioned even our noblest efforts remain, and how easily care can harden into control when fear is left unexamined. This history invites us to look gently but honestly at our own communities and inner lives. We too make decisions shaped by concern for stability, reputation, and safety. We too inherit structures that once served a purpose but now ask to be re-seen. The story of women in the Sangha does not ask us to take sides so much as to cultivate discernment. It reminds us that wisdom is not proven by certainty, but by responsiveness, by the capacity to remain present when answers are incomplete and consequences unavoidable. Perhaps the most enduring lesson here is that awakening does not lift us out of relationship. It places us more deeply within it. The path unfolds not in isolation from human complexity, but through sustained attention to it. Inclusion, exclusion, caution, and courage are not abstract concepts. They are lived choices that shape the moral atmosphere we inhabit together. When insight is genuine, it does not demand perfection from the world. It asks for honesty, humility, and a willingness to continue seeing. As the fire burns lower and the night grows quieter, this reflection does not conclude with resolution, but with continuity. The questions raised by that ancient moment are still alive, because they are the questions of being human together. If these reflections have resonated with you, you are welcome to remain here, to continue listening, contemplating, and returning to these teachings as living inquiries rather than settled doctrine. Walking this path is not about arriving at answers, but about learning how to stay awake within the unfolding of our shared experience.